So I am going to start the recording. Um, as everybody knows, we have Kelly Billing from Maryland. She's a certified horticulturist, and she's going to give us a little presentation on the Lotus. Kelly, all yours.
All mine. So I guess where I will start. I was going to do a little history of Lotus because, let me see, how am I? There we go. I'm advancing that way. A little bit of history. I've been I guess my first plant I fell in love with as a child was 4 o'clocks, and the fact that they would stay closed all day and open in the afternoon. I was fascinated with that and became fascinated with plants with stories. And Lotus probably has the best story, the longest story, the most diverse story of anything. And it has been um, an inspiration for all kinds of art and architecture. Um, Paula Biles, I don't know how many of you know Paula Biles. She and I wrote a little book about Lotus for the International Water Gardening Society many years ago. At that time, actually worldwide, there were only, I think, 4 or 5 books about Lotus in the whole world. And despite the fact that it's been such an inspiration culturally and architecturally, in so many parts of the world, even in India, they had not been growing lotus for years and years, which is really where the love of lotus and inspiration religiously and culturally had happened. There was not that much growing. This was an art piece actually from a side of a bus in Thailand. This is a friend who just is a graphic artist that Paula and I know. And another friend that's an artist that does plant art through X-ray, and he does it with all kinds of plants. And I can't remember his name, which is terrible. You can look at his website. It's fascinating to see plants from that perspective. But when Paula went to Thailand, I didn't get to go on that trip. She brought me back a box wrapped in a real lotus leaf that had been painted. And I called friends of mine in Thailand and I said, how do you do that? And they said, well, that's a Thai trade secret. We can't share that. So I started to fool around and I make my own art also with lotus leaves. I use metallic paints and I attach them to a canvas. That's one of my favorite ones. It's a little 6x6, but in art and architecture everywhere, it's not always as a flower, but as an inspiration to some other form. Even in other countries, and I can't remember where this one is either, but it is a building, it's a place of worship for all religions. It doesn't matter what your worship is, you can go there. At night, it's absolutely incredible. I just find some of these buildings, the depth of appreciation in different countries. Actually, that's in India and Singapore. This is one of my favorite. This is a museum that was modeled after a lotus. It has no actual lights in it. The shell of the museum, each petal is a gallery, and the shell of the building itself is light permeates it. So all pieces of artwork are illuminated from every direction. I found that a fascinating feature of architecture. Underneath of it
Kelly,
are water lily pools. Yes.
I have somebody asking, Marla, are you not seeing Kelly's screen? Where is Marla? I gotta find Marla. There's Marla. Marla, are you not seeing this screen that everybody else is seeing? Everybody else is seeing it, I'm assuming. You're muted. Hold on. Go ahead, Marla.
I
Now you're
see
on.
some thumbs up, so yeah.
So everybody else is seeing the screen. Are you there, Marla?
Yep, I'm here.
Okay. Are you not seeing the screen?
Nope. Maybe I should log out and come back in. This has been acting strange ever since I got in.
Okay. Yeah, you might want to because everybody else is seeing the screen. So
Okay, sorry
might
about that.
must be on your end, my dear. Try and I'll
Figures.
get you right in.
You want me to wait for her?
Um, well, we can give her a half a minute here. Come on, Marla. Here's Marla. Blink. Okay, Miss Marla. As soon as I find her in my list of people here, see if she's able to see the screen. Okay, there's Marla. Okay, Marla, are you seeing the picture of a fountain? Yep, she's
She's
got it.
got it
Found.
now.
Okay, go ahead then. Thank you for waiting, Kelly.
Oh, no trouble. So underneath in the museum are water lily pools that surround the whole base of it. And when it rains, the center of well, actually it's recirculated. The center of the museum has a waterfall that falls directly through from that circle in the middle, that falls through to the base where the water lily pools are surrounded. A real masterpiece of architecture, based on, the inspiration of Lotus. You can see there is a hotel that is behind that, that has a swimming pool on the top of it, that arched building, and the museum, which looks then completely teeny tiny down there on the top, I guess, top left corner. Hotel opened, I think, in 2018. And that's the swimming pool on the top of the building. A little bit scary for me. So this is another building, inspiration from Lotus as well. And the petals actually open and close. So in the daytime, they usually unfold, or in the daytime, yeah, they're closed, and then I can't remember. That one looks like at the nighttime they're open and in the daytime they're closed, and it should be reversed. But and this is in, of all places, West Virginia. It is a Lotus. It's a spiritual, non-denominational place of worship in the mountains of West Virginia. At some point in time, I came across, they did a competition in China about if you were going to build a futuristic landscape, what would it look like? And that was the winner. I thought that was pretty downright amazing. If any of you remember, and I can't remember what year of the Olympics, that it started out as rice paddies, and they flipped every one of those quadrants and turned them upside down, and it was filled with lotus. It was when the Olympics were in China. I marvel at how they did that, because if there weren't any water in those beds, then the lotus would be completely dried up and crumpled. And they flipped them all, told a story through movement, and then filmed most of the opening ceremony through the lotus leaves. I had the pleasure of going to China. They have enormous celebrations. Hundreds of people gather to celebrate the lotus, to share knowledge, information, cultivars, breeding processes. China is the absolute world leader. I serve on their expert panel of Lotus. I was fascinated with the way they embrace it. I thought that when I went to China that I was going to see something completely different, that they were very connected to nature. Knowing all that I know about how they interact or worship, adore, it is their largest crop outside of rice in China. So it's for, like we eat pasta and potatoes, they eat rice and lotus. A huge part of their diet. So they have research for cut flower, for ornamental, for food. I think they have a 25,000 acre facility that is Lotus for research testing for just for food crops. It's remarkable and amazing. Then as part of their celebration, they drink wine through the stem of the lotus leaf to extract the life-giving juices. So lotus makes a very milky sap if you've ever broken it. And they fill the leaf with wine, and once a year they do that. It is the inspiration not only for art and architecture, but science. The leaf of the lotus is impermeable. It cannot get dirty, no matter how hard you try, because I've tried, my kids have tried, but it doesn't. NASA was the first step in using Lotus for what they call the Lotus effect. They first mission to the moon, the biggest problem that they had was space dust going from their outerwear into the capsule and getting into the computers and things. So they designed a fabric that would mimic the leaf of the lotus, and the dust wouldn't stick. My daughter works for a company now that was the first company in the United States to make lotus fabric on a commercial level, and they do it for surgical scrubs. So if there is blood splatter in the OR, it just simply runs to the floor to reduce blood-borne disease transfer. So if you put dirt on a leaf and then you put water, it just simply washes away. So there are paint is called Lotus Sand, and it was designed in Germany. So you paint a building. If you're in a dusty or a high wind area where things get dirty all the time, then if you paint with that paint, as soon as it rains, the building becomes clean again. If you use Rain-X on your car windshield, that's Lotus effect technology. Outdoor furniture, outdoor carpets, umbrellas, let's see, convertible car tops are all now made with fabric that has Lotus effect or Lotus technology. This is 10,000 times water droplets, and their pollen and dust attached to the water droplets. And what really is the factor that keeps them from getting dirty is actually nothing ever touches the leaf surface. All of those little prickles and points are 10,000 times magnified, never let anything get near the surface. So all parts of Lotus are used for food and medicine. I use it for high cholesterol. I have other people who use it for high blood pressure. You can make lotus leaf tea. So I read it's also good for weight loss, but I don't drink it often enough, obviously, for that to happen. But the medicinal dosage, if you're treating cholesterol, is a 4-inch square, which I don't cut mine square. I just cut my leaves into tiny pieces and toss them till they're dry and store them in a canister and use them all winter. And you can use them fresh or you can use them dry. My cholesterol went up every year for 12 years. And I drank lotus leaf tea for, probably 2 to 3 times a week. and it went down 40 points in 3 months. So I still drink it, not as much as I ought to, but it's very good. Just tastes like green tea. It works for people with high blood pressure. Most Lotus that is used for food has a big fat tuber, as opposed to what we see as a long skinny tuber that looks more like bananas. Edible Lotus tubers are bigger and fatter. I did import some last year. I couldn't import this year because of COVID, but my edible tubers did not make it. I used a grower who didn't have experience, and most of the things survived, but not the edible tubers. And when you cut into them, they have a really beautiful pattern, which makes them really pretty. You can use them to make candy. I gave them to a school teacher that my son had. And the instruction that had been given to me was, if you slice them 1/4 of an inch thick, peel them, slice them 1/4 of an inch thick, put them in a medium hot oven, and when they start to curl, they're done. So she made them for all the children. And then she thought that they weren't going to like it plain, so she put sugar, cinnamon, powdered sugar, all different things on them to make them taste better. And it turns out they didn't like any of them except the plain ones. They make their own sort of sugar. They're kind of like an okra, where they have a thickening agent in them. So that thickening agent, when you make candy, is really just what happens when you bake them. They make the best potato chips. Like here are fried Lotus chips around the outside. Absolutely delicious. Better than any potato chip you will ever eat. So you just slice them super thin and fry them. I have a doctor who is from Sri Lanka, and his mom cuts Lotus stems paper thin. They mix them with hot spices, dry them, and then they store them. And when you want to eat them, they just toss them into hot oil and they eat them hot and crunchy. He says it's still his favorite food. In China, we ate them in every way you could ever possibly imagine. And I could show you hundreds of pictures of Lotus as food, but beautiful as it is, I would get carried away. The seeds are edible. My son was raised in the nursery. Both my kids were. And my son would disappear for hours. It got to a point where we told them they couldn't have any more seeds because they were just ravaging all the plants, tromping in the basins. And so what they did is they set up a shop and they colored rocks and drawings, and they hung them at the counter where you first came in, and they had prices. I think they were 50 cents and 25 cents. 50 cents for a rock and 25 cents for a picture. But if you were willing to barter, they would really rather trade Lotus seeds, because they weren't allowed to get in the water. They said, well, we could just get a customer to go in the water and give us that pod, and then we would trade you like 2 pictures and a rock. So they would hide them in their shirts, in their pockets, and we started to think, there's something addictive about these. Maybe we shouldn't let them eat so many. Like, this is just strange, and they can't seem to get enough of them. But they ate them all the time. We eat them all the time. We eat them here at the house all the time. We have a Lotus patch, a native stand near here. My son has been known to disappear for anywhere from 3 to 5 hours out eating Lotus seeds, and it's like a 50-acre patch. So you can disappear in there pretty easily. But they are delicious. The young seeds are very sweet. They then shift to sort of, as they mature, the taste of a dried pea. And then as they start to get a little mahogany color to them, they taste like a chestnut. So my son only eats the young sweet ones. Some of them, like the ones on the left, never got fertilized, so there's nothing in there. You would only eat the big fat ones. And then if you cut that in half, inside of each seed is the embryo. The first 2 leaves of every lotus. And that doesn't matter if those seeds are 2 days old and mature or 2,000 years old and mature. Every seed is identical on the inside. If you are going to eat them, you peel off the hard outer green skin. And then some people, and I've noticed since I have more Chinese cultivars, they've always said to me that the center leaves are bitter. And I had never tasted that until this year. American lotus seeds, the leaves in the center are not bitter at all. We just pop them in our mouth and eat them. But I have had to remove the center leaves from a few that I have tried this year from some of my Chinese cultivars. The leaves can be pulled out and dried, and if you make a tea with them, they will make you go to sleep at night. So what I also learned there is that the dwarf cultivars, the tiny ones, taste terrible. They thought that was so funny that I even tried to eat a miniature lotus tuber because they taste like bad medicine. And I would suggest that you not try them. But the bitterness of the little leaves also doesn't happen from ours, it's only in theirs. So the oldest recorded leaves, I think, that have been germinated, seeds, is 2,500 years ago. Seeds in the Egyptian tombs were removed and sprouted just fine. So they hold indefinitely as long as the temperature is consistent. They aren't wet or soggy or, moldy. You have to, you just have to scar the outside so that the water can get in and they'll germinate. None of these are fertilized. So there's nothing in there. If they're soft, if they're not firm and hard on the outside and nice and brown, they have any like wilting or unformed solid structure, then they won't germinate. And I will also say that there are at least a dozen scam lotus seed sellers on the internet. I see them, they come in beautiful colors, purple and teal, black flowers, hot pink. None of them are real. They're all silk flowers in their advertisements, and they're probably all some standard pink. They say that they don't need to be outside, they don't need any soil. It's all untrue. And there are also many blue lotus seeds available on the internet, mostly eBay, which there are no blue lotus, not yet. The leaves, the young tender leaves, are also edible in stir fry. You can just mix them in like any other vegetable. The stamens are used for medicine. The center pods are also used for medicine. I'm not sure what both of them are used to treat. I just know that they are used medicinally. They are used to ornament. The presentation of Chinese food everywhere we went was just incredible. The lotus pods and stamens and petals decorating everything. There also the petals. Lotus, when they're cut for cut flower, once they've opened, they'll drop their petals. So they're often cut for a cut flower before the flower actually opens. But the petals are also used for tea. Very healthy. There's a great video online, a lady that makes videos about living alone in the mountains of China. And it's beautiful, beautiful. But lotus petals are also used for tea. They can be used wet or dry, fresher or stored, to decorate things. That the petals themselves are also edible. But there you see, there's a flower bud, there's the pod and the stamens and the petals. Quite beautiful. So when they're cut for cut flower, they're cut before they're open. And because they drop their petals after they're cut as a flower, when they're cut before they're open, they usually look pretty much like this, and then the petals are folded to expose the inside color. And there's probably a dozen ways or more that you can fold the petals they're sold in market that way. So they have just taken the outside petals and pressed them back to expose the inside color. And those are primarily used for worship daily. They'll purchase cut flowers. And I learned it from a boy. We had exchange students from different countries around the world, from Argentina to Czechoslovakia to Thailand and most European countries. And one of the boys who worked for us, his grandmother, that was her job, was to fold lotus blossoms for the market in China or in Thailand. And when he went back, he took back every penny he made while he was here to give back to his grandmother, because she had raised him since he was a little boy. Sweetest young man ever. Now he is a famous TV star in a daytime soap opera in Thailand. We don't know what happened to our little M, but he's not a little farm boy anymore. These are folded, and when the petals and the flowers are folded, they start to dry that way. So we take them after they've worn out their welcome in a vase, and we hang them upside down, and then we spray paint them, and we use them to decorate wreaths or dried flower arrangements. So the unopened flowers dry really well. Seed pods are often used for cut flower arrangements, but they're my children, this was my daughter painted this when she was a little girl. We would paint them all different colors. Some had stripes, some had polka dots, some had the insides colored a different color. Some of them were painted with a sponge, but we did all kinds of applications to add them to arrangements. And then these are ones that we did where we had mixed pods, unopened buds, and some are folded. It's a lot of fun. We sort of do these things in our family, like when we're gonna make steamed wontons, we have folding contests. Who can fold the prettiest ones? So we did the same thing with lotus blossoms all the time with my kids. It's like finding a different way to fold them than we already knew. The pods have a lot of color too. On a lot of my Chinese cultivars, we see a lot of red. They're beautiful, mixed with other greens, but a lot of color to the seed pods. This is one of my favorite. I've not conquered this one yet, but it's really beautiful. They fold them and float them in arrangements. So I think I know how they do that one. They use two different folds, one in the middle and one on the outside. You can also make fabric with Lotus. Getting ready to place an order with a company in, I think she's in Vietnam. Monk's robes are made from Lotus fabric, and it takes about 200,000 stems to make enough fabric to make a monk's robe. And most of the time that is done for free. It costs, if you want to buy raw material, about $700 a yard. It takes a very long time, but the fabric keeps you cool in summer and warm in winter. We find that the leaves, we use them as hats when we're out on the boat. You'll see some pictures of that later. And they keep you extremely cool. But they have an ability to regulate temperature. So they cut stems and they pull thread and until they have a spool, and then it's woven into a very beautiful fabric. The company that I'm going to buy some scarves from, they dye all of their scarves with only natural dyes, water lilies for purple and orange, and it's a fascinating plant. That's my darling son, who is now 6'2" and a firefighter. When he was a little boy. And that was our first lotus tub. When we first planted it, there was nothing else in the yard. We were in a new development. There was absolutely nothing but barely turf from seed that the builders had put down, and no one had planted a tree in the neighborhood, and we sunk a tub in the backyard. And I asked my son, I said, do you know what build it and they will come means? And he was at this age, maybe a year younger, and he said no. So we planted that lotus tub, and in 14 days we had a list of 14 things. Not all, not one a day. We found some days we found 2 or 3 things, and other days we found 1 or none. But the amount of wildlife that is, lotus is one of the highest oxygen producing plants in the world. It's used for water purification, ornamental, food, but all of those things. But it also, because it makes so much oxygen, it is a magnet for wildlife. There's actually a legal battle in Michigan over whether the American lotus should be allowed to recover in the river or not. But back when automobile manufacturers were dumping all of their wastewater, the lotus died, and it's now making a comeback. But they've also seen sturgeon in the river that they haven't seen in 50 years. They're seeing mayflies, all kinds of things come back with the lotus because of its high oxygen. There's a little frog hidden in the center of that flower. One of our favorite things is looking for tree frogs in lotus blossoms. But in Minnesota, where it's making a comeback, or Michigan, I'm sorry, it's Michigan near Detroit, where it's making a comeback, there is a fight over whether it should be killed to leave the room for recreation or left to improve the water quality of the river. I'm not sure why it's a battle, but there is a huge amount. I mean, my son and I, it was bees, butterflies, tadpoles, water boatmen, water skates, ladybugs, dragonflies. The other interesting thing about lotus is it is one of the few plants on the planet that can change its temperature. So inside of a folded, closed lotus bud at night, the temperature can be 84 degrees, even if it's 40 degrees outside. So oftentimes pollinators will spend the night in a closed blossom so that when the flower opens, they're already warm and already dry and can go about their business of pollinating without any delays. These are dragonfly larvae, the empty shells from where the dragonfly larvae climb up out of the water and hatch from the stems of the lotus. I'm particularly fond of this photograph, a spider that has emulated himself to look exactly like a lotus seed so that he can hide well. I think that's pretty amazing. So lotus comes in just about any size that you can imagine, from small enough to fit in a teacup to large enough to have, when I was in China, I saw plants with 15-inch flowers and 36-inch leaves. Unbelievable. Like, even for me, I was just like taken aback. You know, I've never seen anything that big, and I've grown them in some really big beds. The more room they have, often the bigger they'll get. There are quite a few micro lotus on the market now. I have not experimented with them. I have taken some small lotus and taken small dwarf cuttings and put them into tiny pots. Not quite a teapot, but say I have a 5-inch. They're increasing in popularity. I think they're very difficult and very finicky, and they're more like a bonsai to me that requires regular attention. So you're microdosing nutrients, you have to pick the algae out, you have to make sure that you keep them clean and free of disease because they're so tiny, you know, something can take over. So I am more of the, if you live at my house, you have to be really tolerant, because if you aren't, then you have to go. Like, I have children, animals, you have to be able to be run over, slid on, rolled around on. That's sort of my house. So although I have fooled around with it, and I just am on the run all the time, they're not made for me. They might be made for some people, but they're not made for me. It's a bit more of an art form than the easy way to grow lotus in larger containers. I think they're cute. They get little flowers, but just not, I'm just not a fan. I think I'll play with it a little bit more, but I still think they require too much work, too much energy. I have a little window box that is just 8 inches wide by 2 feet long that I have long grown Helvola in before and after. I tried it for a few years with Lotus in it, and this is one called Sparks, which didn't winter for me so well. Some of them are not quite as hardy. Where the Helvola sit on the driveway all winter, they freeze solid. They still come back every year. If it's going to be in the single digits or low teens, we'll slip it into the garage. But these, even with some extra care, didn't survive. We had 3 mild winters, and then the 4th winter was really hard, so they didn't make it. But I'm kind of always of the theory is that if I plant it and they make it, that's great. If not, I get to try something new, so it doesn't upset me too much. But I can say that the small lotuses are so adaptable. You can grow them in a window box, in a small container. They don't have the requirements or the needs that, say, in the little teacup or tiny pots that are 5 or 6 inches. They're really, I mean, I drop a half a dozen fertilizer tablets in there once a month and make sure it stays full of water. They do get so leafy that you do have to supplement for the rainwater, because most of the rain it never makes it to the container. So you do have to add water more often, but other than that, super easy to care for. All the small lotus, pretty much if it holds water. I've had customers who use old bathtubs. I have a customer who's used a whole bunch of old toilets because he's a plumber. He brings them home, he bogs the bottom. He made this thing on the hillside of all of these toilets. If it holds water, then it can probably grow lotus. He's in a milder climate than y'all, but very easy. The dwarf lotus in pretty much anything that holds water. My son loves to photograph plant material, especially. These are his photographs. He was like 7, 8. So lotus in containers is sort of a rollover from the way that they're grown all over the world. This is a grower in China. It's just what we call can to can on the ground. So if it's about that size or that shape, you can grow lotus in it. As long as the container can take a freeze, a lot of the time they can be nestled in. I have customers that take them in really cold climates and they just nestle it against the house or in a corner somewhere for winters, pack some straw around it. It's fine. I'm zone 6B, so we can leave ours out. I mean, if we get really extreme temperatures, it's only usually for a day or 2. So I might slide them into the garage, but I might not. Most of the time they make it. My theory is that the decaying matter that's in there from the growing season generates enough warmth on top of the plant, because the roots are all the way at the bottom, that winter protection, it only in the coldest climates is it really required in a raised container. This is on the deck of my boyfriend's house. We made some with carnivorous plants, some with lotus, some with water lilies, and they all wintered just fine until we had a winter that the pot broke. So it got a crack in it and leaked out the water, but the plant was fine. It had no water all winter, froze many times, and we pulled it out and put it into another pot, and it was just fine. It's on a deck, so it gets cold underneath, on the sides and the top, so it was frozen. Plant was fine. This is in a garden in New York. There's zone 6A, I think, where this was, and that lotus has been there, was there. That garden center's not there anymore, but was there for years. It wintered outside just fine. And the concrete containers also hold some of the radiant warmth from the day too. The bulkier and the thicker your container, These are in Thailand, and I wish and dream of a day that we have containers like this. This is my favorite. It's just so cool. This is also in Thailand, and this container is 36 inches across. So the leaves are at least 2 feet. But versatility wise, if it holds water, you can probably find a way to grow lotus in it. No matter, you know, what size or shape. There are big lotus, little lotus, medium lotus. This is when I worked for Maryland Aquatic, we did floating islands. We've done floating islands outside for years in the worst of winters, and they winter just fine. Mine sort of, my pond is on the north side of my house. It gets no sun in the winter, and I've had as much as 15 inches of ice. And they sort of get sunken down into the ice. And then when spring comes and they thaw out, they just pop to the surface and keep on growing. Although I will say some cultivars are hardier than others. This was a residence in Denver. So like I buried a 36-inch container in my perennial garden. They buried to get them a little deeper because they're colder in Denver. These are whiskey barrel liners. So they buried 3 whiskey barrel liners in the perennial garden, and you're only going to put about 6 inches of soil. And then if you have 15 inches of reservoir, then you have that much space for your water level to go up and down. And they do that because it requires less water. Mine's only 12 inches deep, so I have 4 inches of soil, so I have 8 inches of water. In a deeper container like a barrel liner, you get a larger water reservoir for lower maintenance. This is at Brookside Botanic Garden, Alba grandiflora in a display. These are on a mound, about a 4-foot high mound. So the pot, the top of the pot is 4 foot above ground level. And then they use fragrant plants all the way around the outside. And that is a 60-inch container. So the more room they have, the more they bloom, the happier they are. And I find growing lotus outside the pond is a whole lot easier than growing them inside the pond. All you have to do is throw fertilizer in and make sure it has water. You don't have to, if they're in the pond, you have to go into the water to fertilize them. Or if you use them in the pond and fertilize them by moving water, that's a lot lower maintenance, a lot less work. These are all in my backyard. That little lotus that started out just being buried, we built a playhouse, we built a big garden, then we built a pond all around it. But year after year, until I got 2 puppies 2 years ago who decided to eat it one winter, it was out there since 1996. Since 96. Same plant. So 2 years ago, the dogs ate it because there were frogs. And if you're diving for a frog, then you might get a lotus. And if it smells really bad, you might want to eat it. And that's how the story went. So they drug the entire thing out and ate the whole entire plant before I caught them. All of it, all 36 inches of stinky roots, they ate the whole thing. So I have replaced it, but the tub has remained the same. And I have literally done nothing. I drop fertilizer tablets in periodically, and I don't even do it on a timely basis. I pull out old growth every spring that rises to the top, and I throw a shovel or 2 of dirt in each year just to give it some renewed soil. And that's it. And it's the lowest maintenance thing that I have in my garden. At Longwood, this is a 10-foot, I think it's 10-foot sewer pipe turned on its side. It's been in there 18 years without being maintained. They do the same thing I do. Pull off some of the previous year growth that rises to the top because the roots are always at the bottom, and they fertilize it. That's it for 18 years. And it looks like that every single year. So in the nursery, we grew them in 3.5-foot wide beds. And they were any length. I had a customer who needed a flowering hedgerow in summer for a property that they only used in the summer months. They had multiple residences around the world, and they said, well, we would just love to have a flowering hedgerow in August when we're here for the summer. So that's what we did. A 400-foot long, 4-foot wide lotus bed that ran the whole length of their property. Graded the soil so that all the rainwater headed toward the lotus. So it acted also as a vegetative filter before the lawn water went into the Chesapeake Bay. So you can build it any shape, any dimension. There'll be a suitable size. It can be round. I'll often have on a client project, because lotus outside the pond are so much easier to maintain, we'll build a pond and then a lotus area, a bed that mimics the shape of the pond. So they're actually separate for maintenance purposes, but look like they're together. Or we'll use it as a filter and pump water through it. They're huge nutrient hogs, one of the best plants ever for maintaining good water quality, and so easy to manage if they're in their separate tank.
Kelly, we have a couple of questions. So
Sure.
you never divide your lotus plants?
Um, I do for production purposes, but for that one that's at home, it's only if I need tubers. Otherwise, I can leave it and just pull that old vegetation off every year. So
Okay,
what
so
happens is all lotus circle the bottom of the pot looking for a way out, because that's their nature, is to run 20, 30, 60 feet a year. So if they have no place to go, they run around the bottom of the pot trying to find a way out. When the tubers form, they push the old growth up. So in the spring, all I do, it takes me 15 minutes, is I go in and I just start grabbing, and anything that I pull out, I just trim it if it's brown, and I just keep going. And as soon as some white tubers start to float up, I'm done. So then I push it down and then throw a couple of shovels of dirt on it and let it go for the next year. But I don't need to harvest the tubers.
okay.
They
The
can stay.
second part of the question is we've been told no square containers. Is that a myth?
I think it's a myth. I've used plenty of square containers. All of our growing beds at the nursery, this is a growing bed, and they're all, these are 4 by 8 foot beds next to each other. Actually, all my lotus right now are growing in 4 by 6 beds. They're all rectangular in shape. I've never had an issue. Actually, what I find, and the reason that I grow them for production in a rectangular container, is all the tubers congregate in the corner. So when I go to harvest, I just need to flip up that corner. I harvest all of my tubers, and then I drop it back down, and then I go to the next corner and flip it up, and I can either leave one of the 4 corners for production, or I can harvest them all, and fingers crossed there's enough of them in the middle to rejuvenate all that growth. But all of my growing beds are rectangular. All the growing beds I've ever used since 1986 are rectangular. So I don't see it. I've heard it too, but we find that it makes it an easier harvest. You know where all the tubers are going to be. They're right where they ended, in the corner. If it were really small, like maybe if you had a 2 foot by 2 foot or a 1 foot by 1 foot, maybe they would get jammed up. But I've never seen it. So I don't honestly know what I would be looking for that it would be bad to use a square container. I've never had any occurrence in which I would say that they got hung up under the liner or anything. They just seem to form, and we collect. And so I'd go with myth. I mean, You saw the window box was 8 inches by 2 feet. Was there for 4 years. The winter got too cold, but they didn't die because there were square corners. So I'm going with myth.
Okay. Good. Maybe I go back to
So,
growing lotus.
huh?
I've tried growing lotus in these round baskets, and but I have a um, waterfall that has 5 foot, 6 foot arrows, and I might just build me a nice square 3 foot by 3 foot bucket and plant some lotus in that.
You
And
can.
then I can have my lotus on steroids, right, Jan?
See, and you will, because if you have flowing water, American lotus, everywhere in the wild is in a river. It is a river dweller. It thrives in moving water. So oftentimes when we're trying to deduce what's going to be a good plant for filtration, you look at where it grows in the wild. Lotus is a pure through and through river dweller. It'll grow in a pond very well, but in the wild, it's usually in a river. So it is great at nutrient uptake. It's used all over the world to purify water, except in the United States.
I have a
So,
couple more questions for you. From
sure.
Dorothy, she would like to know um, if you like to harvest the tubers, how and when do you harvest?
I harvest before they're awake, as soon as the water is warm enough that my hands don't lock up.
Okay, sounds like springtime.
Yeah, so you don't want them to be actively growing because then you risk a lot more breakage. So the tighter the shoots are, the new shoots, and the more asleep they are, the easier it is to harvest without breaking them. However, as I get older, I cannot tolerate the cold water on my hands anymore. So it's going to be the first weekend that the air and the water has gotten warm enough before they start growing.
Okay, the second part is she'd like to have you talk about why her lotus seems to be dying back. Not enough fertilizer, temperatures too cold, question mark, question mark.
What zone are you all? 5?
4 to 5, Jan? Yep. Here you go,
Is it
Jan.
4 to 5?
Yeah, she's shaking her head, yes. 4. She's showing 4 fingers. 4A, she says. Okay. We are 4A.
Okay. 4A. So, I mean, they'll winter there. That's not a problem. You have to go deeper than we do for added protection. So 2.5 feet. And they need to have, if there's one thing that I've learned, it's that if they don't have sufficient space, then they're not as healthy as they could be. Weak plants going into winter have more difficulty surviving the winter than strong, healthy plants going into winter.
Okay.
As to the fertilization or them prematurely dying back, if I don't feed, so if I'm growing for production, I don't feed as heavily as if I'm growing for sale. And the reason for that is that I don't want them to expend an immense amount of energy into leaf production if I'm looking to harvest tubers. So, but if I'm growing for retail or for myself, I fertilize heavily. So I'll quit feeding for production 4th of July, mid-July, somewhere in there. If I'm
You got
feeding
quite a few
for,
raised eyebrows on that one.
why? Because I quit early?
Yep.
Yeah. So they go dormant earlier. So the ones that I have at my growing bed, they've been turning yellow for about, I mean, they're still blooming, but they've been turning yellow for about, I guess, a week to 10 days. The ones that I'm growing for sale that I have fed all the way up until the middle of August, are still flowering and have, you know, really mostly green leaves. So fertilizer is usually the dictator of them going to sleep early. But I do that on purpose because, and I cut the flowers and the seeds because I want good tuber production. So mid-July instead of mid-August for feeding. It's only 4 weeks. You want
Does
to
that
be
help,
certain that you
Dorothy?
don't feed. You want to be sure that you don't feed them so late into the season that they don't use it all before winter comes, because you can lose your tubers to salts, unused fertilizer salts, if you have too much food in there that didn't get consumed during the growing season.
I have another question. She has a lotus root that I purchased this spring. It is now the same size, but the tuber is dark, but still solid. So she's wondering if it's dead. Did it ever, I guess, Cindy, did it ever get leaves? Did anything ever come up out of the water? So nothing came out of the water.
So it never grew all season.
Right.
Yeah, so that went wrong way early on.
Okay.
So let me get through the next couple of slides, and then I have a lot on growing.
Okay.
So basically, you know, the size of the container is the size that they're going to grow. The more space that you give them, the bigger they're going to get. So these are sort of some before and after images. So this was at the time of planting. This is 1 year later. This is before planting. This is 5 years later. But he
And that
did get in a little bit of trouble. I warned him, but he didn't listen.
and
These are
that's
actually part of a community pond.
this is that a pond or is that a flowing river?
It's a pond,
Okay.
and it was full of algae and weeds, and he said it stank all the time. And it's actually a cove off of a community lake. And I said, well, you'll be fine until they get out there, and then you're going to get in trouble. And he says, I don't care. I'm tired of looking at this mess and they won't do anything about it. I'm filling it up. And he says, but I'm not filling it up with dirt. He's crazy. He's a little crazy. But so he did. He planted Lotus, and it took about 5 years for them to completely fill it in. And they did make it out to the community, and they have come to an agreement that they'll spray and kill the ones that have gotten out into the lake, but they let him keep his. So they just hit him with some dormant oil spray in early spring when they start coming up, and that's the end of that. And then he built, I think, 6 or 8 more ponds on his property with trails and torches, and they would ride a golf cart through there every evening, and the beaver would come in and he'd shoot the beaver, and I think the beavers weighed more than he did, but he was a riot. But he loved it. He loved the smell in the night, in the moist, humid air. He's in Virginia, but Maryland, Virginia, the smell, even when they're not in bloom, the fragrance when you have that many is unbelievable. Very sweet. So for growing, your tubers should not have mold. They should not have dark spots. This was just a slice of one of what they should not look like when you receive them. This is one that was rotten. The mold is not only on the outside, it's on the inside. So the tubers, when you get them, should be firm, and these are just harvested, but they have been in storage too long, and they're squishy. And they shouldn't look like that or feel like that. They should look like this. And they have this beautiful waxy coating on the outside. It's not uncommon to have some dark patches or some look like scrapes or something. There's nothing wrong with that. And they should have new shoots on them. So when they're dormant, actually, this is a little bit later than I like to harvest because it's already got a shoot coming up. So it's very easy to break that off. So but I mean, it's still a very acceptable time. This is 2 sections of a tuber, which I think should be a minimum. Some people cut that second tuber in half. I do not like to do that because of all of that porous space. All of that is just a pathway for bacteria, disease. So we like to cut them with what we call a tail on them, which as long as you can leave behind it, the better, so that nothing can get in there. So some growers cut them, I do not. I try to keep mine intact as much as possible. But they should have a nice shine to them, a good waxy coating, and be firm. You know, the tail is to the right of that. But that is the perfect tuber to receive in the mail. And it only has 1 joint, but that's all that was formed before you get to the tail or the old runner. So they can have multiple ones. This is one that is cut. This is another grower's photograph. I never do that, but some people do. I also never use gravel. And I include this because there's not one right way or one wrong way. They have perfectly good success doing it this way. I just prefer to do it differently. I only use half the pot full of soil, or 3 to 6 inches. They fill their pot all the way with soil. I find that they don't need as much soil, and it's easier to manage them long term, and you don't have to dump them and then tangle with them. It's just easier. But there's not a wrong way or a right way. This is going to work. I learned it and did it from the beginning differently. It works for them. These are dwarf lotus. So this one could be cut and you could sell actually 1, 2, 3 of them. You can leave them together. You can cut 2. You know, sometimes for growers, it depends on our supply that year. And the dwarf ones make abundant tubers like that. A lot of them. They're more like clustered than they are with the larger ones. Like some tubers, like American Lotus, makes a tuber that is, you know, 2 feet long. And they're very easy to bruise when you pull them out because it's so hard to get such a length out from under the mud when you're pulling them out, and you get a lot of bruising if that tuber bends. We lose a lot of American Lotus. So the tighter, more compact tubers are easier, but they all have different shapes. The most important thing, no matter what the size or how you cut it, is that they have good, strong growing tips, which is probably going to be your biggest key to success, no matter what kind of tuber it is. Once they leave the tuber stage and they start to run, which that person's question, the tuber was dark and firm, but not alive. Those sometimes are, after it has started to run, you'll find the original old tuber in there, and it's still firm and hard a lot of the time, but it's not viable anymore. So I always relate, like, lotus is like a potato. If you stick a potato in the ground, it's going to sprout and grow a plant, but that potato that you put in the ground is going to die. You'll go back and harvest more potatoes, and lotus is the same way. You're going to plant a tuber, it's going to expend all of its energy, and you may still find it intact, but it's not viable anymore because it's dead and it's gone on to make more tubers. But once they've gone to the runner phase, they're harder to get in a box. They're harder to ship. I mean, I still ship a lot of them like that because they're inevitably, there's people who go like, well, I know they've already started growing, but can you just fish one out for me? So, you know, I'll fish it out, and you fingers crossed and hope for the best. The success rate gets lower. And once they get into full-fledged growing, you can't ship them at that point anymore. But the growing tips are what are going to give you that growth. So you can see in this one, there's only about 4 to 5 inches of soil in there. And that's how I grow them, because I find that they don't need 12 inches of soil. 10 inches of soil on, or let's say if it's 12 inches, 8 inches of that soil isn't really necessary, because they're all pushing their growth to the bottom of that pot. So you just have a big pile of dirt sitting on top of that growth. So I find it easier to renew the soil each year. I can harvest, even if I do it from the top. This one is probably a couple years old, but some cultivars produce that many. But all the new growth, all the tubers are going to form at the bottom, always, always, always. So you just can pry off of there. You just sort of untangle the mess and get your saleable tubers. Anything that gets broken or damaged, as growers, we usually use that for ourselves. We don't ship you an at-risk tuber. We should be shipping you what I call A, B, and C tubers. A goes to a customer, B stays with me, and C is really beat up, and I might put 3 or 5 in a pot, but probably something will grow. There are also tropical lotus that never form a tuber. They just run and run and run 365 days a year. So they aren't shippable, but they also have to grow in a really warm climate. Hawaii, South Florida, South America, you know, where it's really warm, where it never gets cold enough to slow them down. And they proliferate, and they run a leaf of flower, a leaf of flower, a leaf of flower all year long. But they don't rest and form tubers. So I know Lily Lou has some in New York, but it means I have to drive to get it. I think she harvested some right before, like the day of her trip back from China, and she was successful getting some growing here in the United States. But they don't like to be cut and put in a box, and odds are she probably washed the whole thing clean and got it back that way. They won't go on a normal shipment. And you all are too cold for that, but I just put it in there for information purposes. No one's quite sure where or how they originated, and there is a discussion about whether they will be given a third classification as a species, because lotus cultivars around the world have now been counted of named cultivars. So in the United States, we had maybe 40, 45 when I started years ago. Now there are, and we knew that there were several hundred, maybe 600 to 1,000 in China. And then there's Japan and Vietnam, Korea, all Thailand, all these other countries. So there is a compiled list of named cultivars worldwide, and we're over 4,000 named cultivars. All of those plants came from 2 species. American and Hindu lotus were the 2 parents, the only 2 parents on the planet where all other lotus cultivars came from. The tropical one is found in India, and there is a discussion about giving a 3rd species worldwide. China is currently doing the DNA research to be able to create a new classification. And DICA has mapped nearly by DNA all species lotus in most continents of the world. So one of the remarkable things is, even in a species, a plant will have a variation from very warm to very cold. So we know that American lotus grows from the Yucatan Peninsula and even parts of Venezuela, Colombia, Chile, all the way to Canada. So ordinarily, DNA research would say that the ones in the South America would be different than those in Canada, that they would have mutated to adapt to the broad range of circumstance and temperature and climate and soils that they grow in. American lotus has not. It's relatively the same, no matter whether it's at Venezuela or Canada, which is remarkable among any plant species. So it's pretty cool, which is one of the reasons that they're also looking at designating tropical lotus as its own species, because no matter where you move it, it doesn't form a tuber. No matter what climate you put it in, it just doesn't. If it gets too cold, it'll just die. Growing them from seed, I will again warn that 99.9999999% of any seed offering on the internet is probably fake. I do collect my own seed and name them. I can tell you, in all honesty, most of what you're going to get is not a good plant. I've started, I don't even know how many seeds. Most of them never even flower. They're not worthy of anything. I do have some seeds from some people that do DNA research, and in China, it's so cool. They're so advanced and so ahead of us in plant research, especially lotus research, because it's so important to them. They can create a seed by normal pollination process, and then they'll harvest it using the DNA of both parents. They have a target DNA that they're looking for. They can then, before they even sprout the seed, do a nick to the seed coating and see if they've achieved the DNA picture that they're looking for, and if not, they throw it away. But I'm willing to take the things that they don't want because they're so advanced that if you sprout their seeds, you're likely to get something wonderful, but not what they're looking for. They throw away. So an average grower in China is looking at around 2,000 to 3,000 seedlings at any given time to see if they're worthy of production and naming. They throw away nearly all of them. So most growers do not have the DNA research table that Dika does, but so it takes anywhere from 1 to 4 years to know if a new lotus is viable as a new plant. So they're looking at a couple of thousand at a time, but most of them don't qualify. They're very picky, very, very picky over there to make sure that you don't water down the pool and have a whole bunch of plants that look the same. It just doesn't serve anyone well. So seedlings, I mean, to me, it's something that's fun to do. I'm not a hybridizer. I don't have that brain. I have a creative brain, not a science brain. Learned that a long time ago. So, but I do, Dika often shares seeds with me. I don't know if any of you know, Laura Bancroft has one called High Cotton. It's a double white. It's absolutely beautiful. It blooms like crazy. It was a seedling that Dika said that it didn't make their cut. And it's beautiful. It's fantastic. It's a great lotus. I love it. It's one of my all-time favorites. It's as photogenic as Mrs. Perry D. Slocum. The doubles are just so, I don't know if a plant can be sexy, they're sexy. They're just so full of petals and the color shifts and tones. They're absolutely beautiful. So High Cotton was a throwaway. That was a gift from Dika, and I have some. But if you're going to grow them from seed, you need to file the outer seed coating, and you don't want to get to white. You can see in the center there, you're starting to get to white. You don't want to get to white. You want to stop right there. You just throw them in a jar of water and they sprout in 7 to 10 days. Super fast. They don't like to be moved. I can tell you, lotus seedlings do not like to be moved from point A to point B. So as soon as they get about 4 to 6 inches, I plant them before they develop a lot of root. It seems as if that energy that's been stored to get them going is easily damaged. So this is absolutely the latest that I would plant seedlings. They're just a bunch of seeds that were thrown in a tub with some dirt in the bottom. And as soon as they start, you can see the seed in the center and the pink shoot running out. That's the latest that you want to plant them into a pot. And it is fun. So once they get a little bit of a root mass, then, you know, anytime before there until there is when you would want to plant. And you do a lot of destruction and trying to untangle them and get them, and they get dried out in the time it takes to untangle them. So here I just have some photographs of some of the cultivars that have been more recently created. And when you think that all of these came from one yellow and one pink lotus, it's fascinating. Most of the Chinese cultivars until recent years didn't have any yellow. You could tell the difference between an American cultivar and a Chinese cultivar because the American cultivars had some yellow petals and all of the Chinese didn't have any. But now that they have American Lotus, they have worked on getting a lot of yellows. This is one of my favorite. It's called 1,000 Petal, and the bud gets so fat. There's around 680 petals in each of those. They have to count them. In China, it's funny, when Deika came here to do the DNA collection, because I have a native stand of American Lotus here in Maryland, so he took samples from Texas, east to Florida, north to Canada, west to Michigan. And he DNA sampled all of those American Lotus. And I mean, they are so far ahead of us. The detail and the photographing and the record keeping that they do. So whenever they have a new cultivar, that they'll have to take 100 flowers and count the petals and come up with an average. I mean, they don't mess around. It's serious business for them. So it's been counted many times. I don't count them. I'd lose count and I'd have to start over 87 times. I'm not the science brain, but it's pretty remarkable. And that plant has a great story. At some point in time in China, the government decided that you couldn't have anything for pleasure or for food. And the army came through house by house by house by house, and they destroyed everything that you had. And when Deika started the research institute in China, after he came here to the United States to get his PhD, he went back to China. They started the Chenshan Botanic Garden and Lotus Research Center. And his is all for ornamental purposes. This lotus was brought to him by a young lady whose great-great-great-grandfather, however many greats were in there generations ago, after the army came through, he saved a small piece of this lotus and hid it on the rooftop from the army so that they wouldn't take it. And she said, when I read about you're starting the research center, I knew that I had to bring a piece to you. And she traveled all the way across China to bring him a plant so that he could have it as part of the research center. So I have another friend who is from Australia who spends all of his time going from mountainous villages all throughout China to find new cultivars that have happened by bees, by people, by most people in the mountains in China grow lotus outside their front door, and they use that water for cooking. If you live in the mountains of China, you don't have public sewers, and so they keep their water clean by growing lotus, and then they use that lotus tub. The roof water fills the lotus tub. The lotus tub gives them their water for cooking. And because a lot of their other waterways may be polluted from these old groups, they've lived in the mountains forever. I don't think you call that a civilization, but I think you get what I mean. But he travels all over China. There are ones with orange stamens. I mean, he has to take buses and walk for miles and miles and miles, days actually, to get to some of these remote areas in China. He's just a collector, I guess you could say, by foot.
I do have a question from Jan. She says, how can you tell if a lotus is hardy or tropical by variety?
You can't tell when they're growing. You can only tell by whether they form a tuber. That comes from the knowledge of the grower. You're not going to be able to look at one and say it is or it isn't. You would have to have history with that plant. And if you're somewhere north, you probably can't grow one unless you have greenhouse space, warm greenhouse space. But some of them, I call that one strawberry shortcake. I just love that one. But to think that all of these shapes and colors and sizes all came from two plants it's pretty amazing.
Dorothy
When I
has
went to a botanic, there was a school of botany in China. And when we were touring the gardens, he said, do you see that one over there? That one is 300 years old. That lotus is 600 years old. That lotus is 900 years old. And the impact of that kind of history, that they know that, was pretty amazing. I think I started with that picture, didn't I? This is my friend in Australia who follows lotus all over the world. This is his lake. And in the background is the sea. He is quite a photographer. Grant, this is Grant, and he's from Australia. He is very fond of large hybrids. When I said that they're 15 inches across, like they're 15 inches across. And the smell is heavenly. And Grant is a huge man. His head is probably 10 inches across. So he's a huge man, very big, very strong. And he travels all throughout China to remote villages where he collects them. One thing that he travels all over. A lot of these pictures came from him. He goes to Vietnam, to Korea, to wherever they're growing, whoever's in season, that's where Grant is. And I think that no matter where you're from, I mean, it's just a magical plant. This is a little girl in France. I think children in particular, I mean, we never use paper birthday party hats in our house. We figured out that if you tie a string to the stem and poke a hole, you can tie it under your chin so it won't slide off. When we go out on the river, this is actually in Maryland, at a Native American lotus patch. This side is about 20 acres. There's a 50-acre patch, about an 80-acre patch. But there are only about 5 remaining places in Maryland where they even grow. Two of the people that work for me, and if you ever get the ability to go see them in the wild, it is, I mean, you just paddle through and you have leaves towering over your head, and when the tide is out, they're taller, and when the tide is in, they're shorter. But it's pretty fun. You know, having them around children, my kids taught me absolutely to love them more than I already could have. They decorated everybody with lotus leaves. We do have a Facebook page that's called About the Lotus that has all kinds of history and culture, photographs from around the world. There's a whole photo album Paula did for years, where she took photographs from people from around the world and married them with a quote. They're absolutely beautiful in the creative uses and things from people around the world. On my Instagram, you know, we tried to, I like it now more than Facebook, more because I can get in and out and it's not so much time, but, you know, sharing pictures of plants, interaction, things like that, inspiration. That was my son's idea. He remembered that his sister used to use them to float baby dolls. and he would throw rocks at them to capsize the ships, and then the babies would sink and she would cry, and he thought that was funny. I didn't, but he wanted to do a photo shoot one day. Mom, can we launch a bunch of boats and take pictures? But that's all I have, and if you have questions.
We do have a question from Dorothy. She was wondering about what to expect from blooms in terms of age of the tuber.
It depends on the cultivar. There are newer cultivars that just outbloom other plants. And there are, the easiest thing that I could equate it to is tulips. So you have early tulips, mid-season tulips, late tulips. They all sort of have their bloom time, but tulips don't bloom from early April all the way to the end of May. Lotus are a little bit like that, except some of the newer cultivars will bloom really early to really late. There are some that do that, but most have a season, say a 4 to 6 week period, that they're either an early bloomer or a late bloomer. I have a 1,000 petal one that it was the last one to start blooming, but it's incredibly abundant. I can say also what I don't like about it is the flowers are so heavy, a lot of times they fall over. You're going to have deeper soil for stability, because with all of those petals, I mean they weigh a ton, and so they want to fall down. So it's really cultivar driven, fertilizer driven. I like to take an early bloomer and a late bloomer and put them in the same pot. I'll also put dwarf varieties in the same pot with the big varieties, so that you'll get little ones blooming around the base of the outside and bigger ones blooming up in the middle. It's funny, lotus are never mixed when you see them anywhere. It's always by cultivar. They have their own space, but I love to mix them. I had a client where we took 16 different cultivars and put them in a 20-foot by 9-foot bed. And it was like an English garden of lotus, just every color, pinks, yellows, multicoloreds, reds, dark pink, light pink, doubles, part whites, all blooming at the same time. A big mishmash, but you seldom ever see that. I'm not sure why. It's kind of a cultural thing, but.
What's your favorite lotus for putting out a lot of blooms in cooler weather?
You know, my two favorite, I have three favorite for durability, and they're Mrs. Perry D. Slocum. However, most growers sell something that is not Mrs. Perry D. Slocum. I had the original in my house since 1996. It was the first one that we planted. Mrs. Perry D. Slocum, if you have the true and correct one, is as sturdy and stable a plant. Consistency should be her middle name. You get the same results every year. Always fantastic, always beautiful. Maybe not the longest bloom season from early spring to late summer, but when it's in bloom, but always tolerates the winter, no matter how strong, how weak. Just consistency. Always good tubers, always a salad plant. That is the one that the dogs ate. Fortunately, I had sent one because I had that since 1990 or 88. And Laura Bancroft asked me if I had any. She had ordered from 10 different growers, and none of them were Mrs. Perry D. Slocum. And did I have what was, I was sure to have the original. I sent them to her the summer before my dogs ate them. So I've then had to have her send them back to me. It is probably the most consistent, photogenic, sturdy, tough plants of all. The true Alba grandiflora which has also made it out of the market. And I got some back from the National Zoo and Brookside Gardens this year. And I won't have them this year for sale, but I will have them next year. Also super sturdy, reliable, consistent, outstanding bloomer, and Nucifera, the straight up pink Nucifera. I think in some plants you get strength in cultivation and hybridization, and in some you get weakness. And although the newer plants flower more and are better in that regard, I don't have enough experience to say that they have the consistency, but I'm also a northern grower. So Laura's in Alabama, I'm in Maryland, and Bergen is in upstate New York, almost to the Canada line. So we compare notes and share information because what works for one doesn't work for the other. So Laura being warmer, she'll get better results out of some things that we don't. But those three are probably the most stick out. There's a new one called Autumn in Moling, which is a yellow, and it's incredible. It will grow really small or really huge or medium. It doesn't seem to care. I have some new ones. I have one from Laura that was one of her cultivars. It's called Princess Ellen. That thing pumps out an incredible number of flowers. It blooms from early till late. It's fairly medium, a little bit bigger than medium, very consistent tuber producer. And then another one that comes to mind is American 3-color. And it has been neglected, abused, mistreated, and it still just comes back every year. I had for years been hoarding Lotus. It's like a bad habit. Like I just see them and I buy them and I don't know where I'm going to put them, and then they overflow in from my house to a friend's house to another friend's house to my mom's house to my brother's house, and then I brought them all and I have them growing in a place, a home now, which is really set up for growing plants. And those have toughed it out with all the neglect, 3 to 5 years in the same pot, no fertilizer, just kept wet, and they consistently performed. I'm a fan of plants that I can neglect and if they still pull through at 100%, then that's the ones I want to grow. I don't want to baby things. I don't want to fuss over them. I just want them to be out there in all their glory and to just love them and not have to work at it. I just think that's the goal.
Okay, we do have a couple more questions for you, Kelly. What NPK numbers do you use for fertilizer?
In Maryland, we're restricted. We're not allowed to have a middle number very high right now. My phone has taken a complete dump now. On my website, my phone died about 5 minutes before this call. And I could dip into the closet and look, but I use Pond Tabs Plus instead of Pond Tabs. Pond Tabs Plus has humates. So I was feeding a 36-inch container 15 tablets every 3 to 4 weeks. And I find I can use 7 or 8 tablets. So it costs about 25 to 30% more, but I'm using half as much. The humates make the fertilizer more available, and I'm not sure what the NPK is. I also use Landon's, but Landon's is extremely hot. And I don't feel like I've conquered it, but I feel like, so this comes from an experience of killing 700 potted lotus one year and 500 potted lotus the next year. This was back in the late 80s or early 90s when we were trying to figure things out. And so I'm always a little mortified when I'm trying some new fertilizer. But I love the Landons. I have the greenest, richest, most flowering lotus of all when I use it, but I know how hot it is, so I use it with a lot of caution. It is a granular, so you have to wrap it in a paper towel to push it in, or some folded newspaper to push it in. And you need to be careful that you stay away from growth. So you don't want to push it in up against a runner or near some stock. What you'll do is you'll burn off that section of the plant. But if you do use it, incredible results. Absolutely incredible results. And we, in a northern climate, never, ever, ever use Osmocote. What happens is, because it solely releases on temperature, what happens for us in the water is by the time the water gets warm, we get a flash release. So you don't get any up front when the plant needs it, when it's in its highest growth. And then when it gets really hot, you get flash release and you'll just kill the lotus entirely. So there is a product called Nutricote, which is made and developed in Japan for rice paddies and for use in water, and it has a different release mechanism. It works also, but it's a granular, but you can use it at the time that you plant because it's a much slower release. But it is hard to find. You can really only get it from like a grower supply, but you can buy it in usually Home Depot or Lowe's as dynamite. I think it's called dynamite tomato fertilizer. It's the same thing as the Nutricote. And I'm not sure what any of the NPKs are. In Maryland, we have P restrictions. So a lot of ours are like 18-0-10 or, 15-0 something. So, which is supposed to be the big claim to fame for flowering, but I find it works equally as well. Although Landon's, if you really want the best results, but it's hot, so you got to be careful. I've burned a lot of things in the process of making sure that I would say not use it in a small container, ever.
We have somebody who wants to know what your Instagram account is. Apparently, there's a lot of Kelly Billings on Instagram.
It should just be Instagram.com Kelly Billing, and it's Lotus.
Yeah.
It's just pretty much all Lotus and lilies.
Yeah, there's no S on the Billings. It's Billing.
Yes, I don't have an S.
Yep.
That throws everyone.
Yep. So she has it up on screen if anybody wants to write that down. Otherwise, you can send me an email.
I'm pretty regular on Instagram, and I gotta say I'm getting terrible at Facebook because it's like email. I go in there and it's like this big time chunk is then missing from my day. And Instagram, you can flip through quicker, and I also put some things on LinkedIn periodically. If you want information, other information, my website has a list of links that I find to be invaluable. So I post them there. Pond Digger, he's a great builder. He does a lot of videos if you're looking to build things. There's another guy that does a radio show, and he hosts different people on different subjects. There's the International Water Gardening Society. There is Water Gardeners International. That was there for, she doesn't update anymore, but she still has great information, great articles. There's several links on there that I find to be really useful, practical, find more information links. They're my go-to websites mostly. Invasive plants, I have a link for there because I maintain the aquatic invasive plant list for the country. Those kinds of things.
Somebody says we saw a photo of you in waders kissing a fawn. Can you tell us about that story?
So one of my customers had a farmer next door bring a deer to her, um, for because he'd found it in the field. The mother didn't return. He went back and checked the next day. Fawn, the little baby was still there, so she took it in. It ended up dying because you're not allowed to have a deer as a pet in Maryland, and no vet would treat it when it got sick. But for whatever reason, she is inclined by, I don't know what blessing. Uh, oftentimes she'll just be sitting outside and a hummingbird will just come and land on her. She has an aura. She has a half a dozen deer right now. They're free to come and go. That original baby that came there played with the dogs, grew up with the dogs, grew up with the family, came in the house with the dogs, out of the house with the dogs. It just made itself at home there. And other deer have just showed up since then. She raised quail and pheasant for release into the wild for years and years. The deer, they have no restrictions. They come and go as they want, but they come back every night and bed down in the barn with the doors are just always open. So they had a pond and the deer was just eating everything. But when I got there, it just came to my car, wanted to climb in my car with me. The entire time that I was in the water, she was cleaning my face. I thought at some point, she just licked my little eyeballs right out of the socket. She's just cleaning my face so hard. So I would plant something, and I think she was just grateful that I would plant something. She would eat some of it, and then she would wash my face again. Like, thank you for the food. Like everything I planted, she ate, and they would just have me come replant. And they had so much joy from her, and she was the sweetest little thing. But they're all, she has a gift. Animals just float into her house. They get mended and then they leave, or they get taken care of. She just, I can tell you how many hummingbirds just come and land on her for no particular reason. Bluebirds, I have a vet that's like that has an aura. I had a really mean dog, and she could just do anything she wanted to him. And I was like, you have a superhuman shield. And she was like, I don't know. They don't treat me like they treat everyone else. So she was the sweetest little thing. Absolutely the sweetest little thing. She lived only a few years, but other deer have replaced her. And she washed my face. If I was at her level, she was licking my face. It was absolutely one of the best days of my whole life. She was a little gem. She would actually, one of the things, her favorite place to sleep in the pond was there was a floating island in the stream that had variegated iris and creeping jenny. And she would walk out onto the floating island and she would bed down in the iris. Somewhere I have a picture of it. I'll have to go dig it up. And that was her sleeping place, was in the middle of the stream in a floating raft amongst the iris, bedded down in the creeping jenny.
All right. Do we have any other questions for Kelly? Okay. Thank you so much. Well,
you're quite welcome.
Where to find her book? I think if you look at the last page of our waterlog, Dorothy, you'll see that Jan printed where to get a hold of Kelly's books. So it's on the last page of the last waterlog we just printed out.
Yeah, I just actually added it to my website. I had run out of copies and a friend was closing her store and sent me 80 more copies. So I have it too. You can order it from the International Water Gardening Society. I think you can get it used on Amazon, but I've seen it. Paul and I have actually had people who have paid over $100. We were like, are you crazy? It was a volunteer project. So it's not a very big book, but it's a very full book.
Okay. All right. I am going to stop our recording. And again, thank you so much, Kelly. I think
Thanks for having me.
I might have some new